Hi, everyone. So I'm Marisol LeBrón. I'm an Associate Professor of Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz. It is my pleasure to be here today and to be moderating this incredible discussion with these amazing authors. I think it's going to be a really fantastic discussion, a really productive discussion. So I'm going to briefly turn it over to our PRSA President, Joaquin Villanueva, to introduce the symposium, and then we'll head into the panel or into the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 PRSA Symposium. We're very, very excited on behalf of the Executive Council of the Puerto Rican Studies Association to have you here. We can't believe that the time has arrived, but we're very excited to finally kickstart this two-day event. So I just want to remind you that this is the first event that we have the Frank Bonilla Book Award, a celebration that you are currently attending. But tomorrow, please don't forget that we have our town hall business meeting at 4 p.m. Eastern time, and our keynote panel in the evening at 6 p.m. Eastern time. So please don't miss those. It's gonna be a great event as well. So without further ado, I'll leave you with our Vice President, Marisol LeBrón, who's gonna moderate this amazing panel. Hope to see you later.
And if you are live tweeting or anything like that for this event, use hashtag Rican Studies. Feel free to tag us. I think some of the authors are also on Twitter and social media. So please do feel free to share all of this amazing information. And as you all would have heard at the beginning, we are recording. So for folks who were not able to make it, we are planning to make this discussion available after. So this is great to finally be able to celebrate this book award. This is actually the 2020 Frank Bonilla Book Award prize. So typically the prize is announced at our biennial conference, and because of COVID, it was canceled. So we were a little delayed, but better late than never. And we're so wonderful. We're so happy that we're able to get these wonderful submissions. So I would just want to, talk a little bit about kind of how incredibly excited the committee was to be able to read these amazing books. So this year's Frank Bonilla Book Award competition really provided the committee with the opportunity to engage with a number of exciting new works in Puerto Rican studies, and the submissions were really fantastic, and it was incredibly difficult to choose. So the entries ran the disciplinary gamut and spanned a wide range of historical time periods, speaking to the breadth of recent works in the field. We were particularly pleased to see many of the entries took up pressing issues related to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, including the fraught nature of citizenship, the complexities of racialization processes, gendered performances, spatial relations, colonialism, and the struggle for a more just future. While all of the entries contributed to our knowledge and helped to stake out new directions in the field, the committee recognized 3 books as particularly innovative texts that contribute to the field, but also complicate commonplace notions of Puerto Ricanness. So I just want to tell you all a little bit very quickly about each of the books, because the authors are going to kind of tell you a little bit about the books themselves. But just in terms of the rationale of why we chose these 3 books. So this year's winner is Ismael García-Colón for his book, Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire, Puerto Ricans on U.S. Farms. The award committee was incredibly impressed by Dr. García-Colón's rich methodological approach and the way that the book draws upon extensive archival research, as well as oral histories and ethnographic interviews with farm workers to paint a full picture of Puerto Rican migrants' experiences with U.S. agricultural labor regimes. The committee felt that Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire cogently laid bare the centrality of labor migration to the modern colonial state in Puerto Rico. Through the rich archive that Dr. Garcia-Colón curated in this book, we see how racialized conceptions of citizenship and by extension, personhood have played and continue to play a central role in colonial labor management. So let's give some virtual applause to Dr. Garcia-Colón for this really phenomenal contribution to the field. So along with colonial migrants at the heart of empire, you know, like I said, it was really hard to kind of go through the entries. They were just so strong this year. We decided to award 2 honorable mentions this year. So we awarded the first honorable mention to Helena Hansen for her book, Addicted to Christ, Remaking Men in Puerto Rican Pentecostal Drug Ministries. The committee was incredibly impressed by Addicted to Christ. We found the narrative to be gripping, and we appreciated Dr. Hansen's approach to questions of masculinity, colonialism, and struggles for belonging. In particular, the committee appreciated Addicted to Christ's approach to a topic, addiction in Puerto Rican communities, which has often been sensationalized and used to justify ideas about Puerto Rican pathology. We felt that Addicted to Christ provided a model for how to do thorough and responsible research with vulnerable communities that seeks to understand how people express agency under structural constraints. This is no easy feat, and we appreciated how Dr. Hansen navigated complex power relations throughout the book. So please join me in congratulating Dr. Hansen. Our other honorable mention goes to Patricia Silver for her book, Sunbelt Diaspora, Race, Class, and Latino Politics in Puerto Rican Orlando. So the committee was incredibly impressed by the methodological depth of Sunbelt Diaspora. In particular, we appreciated Dr. Silver's attention to questions of race and space in dealing with how Puerto Ricans have made a place for themselves alongside other racial and ethnic groups in Orlando. We also appreciated that Dr. Silver did not shy away from the complexities and tensions that exist within Orlando's Puerto Rican community. Through Sunbelt Diaspora's focus on how Puerto Ricans navigated established racial patterns and how Puerto Ricans related to other Latinx groups and the hierarchies that existed between newer and more established migrants, she provides a nuanced study of Puerto Rican migration and settlement that complicates many of our commonly held notions. So please join me in congratulating Dr. Silver for her work. So on behalf of the award committee, which was Milagros Denis Rosario, Rocio Zambrana, and myself, and as well as the executive committee of the Puerto Rican Studies Association, I want to thank you all and congratulate you all on your contributions to the field. So thank you. So in terms of what we're going to do today, we are going to, I'm going to moderate a discussion between the awardees, but please, we're going to have time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to use the chat function. I'll be monitoring the chat, and as well as the, I believe there's a Q&A function. So I'll also be monitoring the Q&A function. But to start us off, I wanted to ask you all to tell us a little bit about your book. And for folks who may not have had the pleasure of encountering your work, tell us a little bit about your book. How did you come to this topic, and what are the questions that guide your work? And Ismael, if you can start us off.
Thank you, Marisol. I'm very humbled and honored by this award. It means more than what you can imagine. I came to the topic of Puerto Rican migrant farm workers as part of my curiosity to understand how government policies form and transform the subjectivities of Puerto Rican workers in mid-20th century Puerto Rico. This interest arises from more than 28 years of research on the impact of land reform on landless workers and farm labor migration. I'm getting old, 28 years. This is the product of those experiences. Some of the parceleros and former landless workers that I interviewed in the 1990s were also migrant farm workers. I also worked at the archives of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, where I helped to organize some of the collections of the Migration Division, the agency in charge of the Puerto Rico's farm labor program. In addition, I studied this subject because of personal reasons. My writings have been profoundly shaped by my experiences as the grandchild of landless workers and growing up in a land reform settlement in Puerto Rico, parcelas communities, and also by the experiences of my relatives who became migrant farm workers. Theoretically, I came to the subject because of my formation as an anthropologist. As a political and historical anthropologist, I locate my work within what some people call anthropological political economy or historical political economy. My research began with the study of state formation in Puerto Rico, and I applied the Gramsci's concept of hegemony to land distribution in Puerto Rico, and that was for my first book, and moved to concentrate on the impact of US immigration policies and citizenship on Puerto Ricans with this second book. In anthropology, my book follows the footsteps of Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History. Wolf ends his book in the early 1900s, and that's when I began to talk about the experience of Puerto Rican farm workers. At the same time, my book departs from the book Labor Migration Under Capitalism, right? A book co-authored by Frank Bonilla. And this is in order to understand how Puerto Ricans were mobilized to satisfy the labor needs of US agriculture. But my focus, different from labor migration under capitalism, is on the state formation, right? That's why labor migration in my book becomes colonial migrants and under capitalism at the heart of empire. In my book, I talk about how the fields of power, where officials, farmers, managers of agribusinesses, residents of rural communities, and politicians deploy colonial policies, right? Racialize Puerto Ricans, define and practice UN citizenship in certain ways, and implemented immigration policies that structure inequality in US agriculture. I mean, some of the questions that my book tries to answer are to clarify this confusion, if Puerto Ricans are immigrants or citizens, to inform us about the contemporary status of Puerto Ricans in US farm labor. What is the influence of US guest worker programs on the development of the Puerto Rico farm labor program? It's one of the questions that I answer in my book. But my book is more than that. It's more than political economy, right? It's about, like I said, the racialization of Puerto Rican men, the role of labor camps in the migration of farm workers, the perceptions and feelings of hope, despair, and estrangement that migrants experience, the resistance of farm workers against exploitation and racism, and the activism of labor organizers, the efforts of government officials to resolve many of the problems of exploitation, but also how some officials also contributed to such exploitation and injustices against workers. And finally, I also try to make brief incursions into the issues of gender and sexuality. But you know, it was already a long book, and I had to cut like 100 pages for the final book to be published.
Thank you so much, Ismael. Helena, do you want to go next?
Sure. It is an incredible honor to be with you and to be recognized for a book that I very humbly offer as a beginner's attempt to understand the experiences of people on the island in Puerto Rico, as well as on the mainland. So I guess the question was, how did we come to the topic of the book and what questions guided the work? And I'll just start by saying that I wanted to push myself. I'm coming from a slightly different place. I'm coming from the place of someone who's in medicine and practicing medicine, but trying to take the best that Puerto Rican studies, ethnic and racial studies, critical race studies, anthropology and social science have to offer those of us who find the clinical models that we use in this country very limited, and actually models that reinforce the race and colonial hierarchies in our country. So that was really my starting point, was I wanted to push myself and my clinical colleagues to understand, for example, the problem of addiction from a radically non-medical point of view. And you know, Puerto Rico, as you mentioned in the introduction, is a place that has been very much stereotyped and associated with drug trade, drug use, cultures of poverty in my own discipline of anthropology. And so, you know, for that reason, I guess it's not an accident that I ended up with field work in Puerto Rico. There are other, I guess, personal and political reasons, which include the fact that I was a transplant to New York City at 18 years of age from California. I grew up in Oakland. And so I was just fascinated by Puerto Rican culture. I was immediately attracted to Puerto Rican organizations and activists as people who were really creatively rethinking how to push back against the colonial order. So it's not an accident, but there are other convergences. So back to medicine. In medicine, we're more and more pushing the idea of addiction as a chronic relapsing brain disease, this idea of a brain disease that really lends itself to medical management. And there's a whole industry surrounding that of pharmaceutical companies, for example, that are getting government subsidies, NIH subsidies, to develop more and more molecular solutions to the problem of addiction. And what I saw in working closer to the ground in communities profoundly shaped by the war on drugs and the way that our policies have driven illegalization of drugs and narco traffic was that there are other competing ways of seeing the problem of addiction. And on the one hand, I came to addiction out of AIDS activism and a concern with post-industrial unemployment, displacement, how narco traffic, I thought, was filling a void in the economic base and sources of power in Black and Latinx communities. What I saw working in AIDS prevention and harm reduction in the center cities of New Jersey and Connecticut was that there were even more models that were really intriguing, spiritual moral concepts of addiction that had gained a lot of momentum both in the cities of New Jersey and Connecticut, but also on the Puerto Rican mainland and Puerto Rican island. So on the mainland, among Puerto Rican, Black, other Latinx communities. But on the island, it turned out that in the moment of my field work, 3/4 of the state registered addiction treatment programs were evangelical, identified themselves as evangelical, most of them Pentecostal. And I followed this thread to addiction ministries founded and run by self-identified former addicts. So this is not a place where I began. You know, I began with a concern about structural drivers of health and the ways that we can push back against clinical models that take the politics out of our health inequalities in a way, and package our solutions to problems like addiction in very profitable terms, you know, in terms of products that can be sold, pharmaceuticals. So I was really looking for alternatives to that approach. And it was a surprise to come across this group of addiction ministries that I had run, that I had seen in action in the cities of New Jersey and Connecticut. But really, I was able to, in my fieldwork, go to Puerto Rico and understand on the ground how they developed and what they represented. So, so that's in broad terms how I came to the work. And a lot of the preoccupation of my research was how, and I can get to that in a little bit in our discussion, but what was going on within these ministries in response to the post-industrial moment. I was surprised to find a real discourse of anti-materialism, a rejection of the world, which was corrupted by profit motives, and that drove narco traffic, but also drove mainstream society. And so I was surprised to find a countercultural movement, if you will, that had these threads of a structural critique, of a critique of the colonial order, of the post-industrial economy, although rendered in a very different way. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Patricia, please.
Sorry about that. I always forget that part. So I just want to thank the awards committee and the executive council of the Puerto Rican Studies Association for giving this recognition to Sunbelt diaspora, race, class, and Latino politics in Puerto Rico and Orlando. I am truly honored to be included with the other panelists in this program, and immensely appreciate their books as well, which I've had a chance to look through. So my intent as I was writing this was to make it accessible to undergraduates and still provocative for graduate students, and especially for it to be of interest to Orlando readers who gave so much of their time and confianza to make it possible. So to that end, the book is divided into 3 parts. There is a 2-chapter theoretical introduction, and that's followed by 3 chapters that I think are probably of most interest to the Orlando readers, along with others. But that pieces together a history of what I refer to as Puerto Rican Orlando, or really Central Florida area. And I always stress a history because there is so much more to be done. I pieced together what I could do. And then the 3rd part uses an ethnographic moment that I had no idea would happen as I began my research, but it's a 2011 redistricting process in Orange County, Florida, which is where Orlando is located. And then the subsequent lawsuit, which was brought by Latino Justice against Orange County for diluting the Latino vote during redistricting. So this ethnographic moment helps me to situate race, class, place, and Latino politics in Puerto Rico and Orlando into a contested process about the mapping, the physical mapping of local political representation. Sunbelt diaspora brings, I think we're all anthropologists on this panel. So Sunbelt diaspora brings an ethnographic and anthropological approach to a political question about how Puerto Ricans and other Latinxes arriving in Central Florida have drawn on their divergent experiences of race and class in other places to navigate the encounter with this new place, where a Black-white frame has long defined political affiliation and where Latino politics has been about Cubans in South Florida. This was not my first question, though. I arrived in Orlando in 2005 to take a 4-year visiting position at the University of Central Florida. I arrived from Puerto Rico, where I had been doing my dissertation research and completing my dissertation on a school reform project in the 1990s. I didn't know a whole lot about Orlando, Florida, or the Puerto Rican community there. Felix Matos Rodriguez and Jorge Duani had written a report I'd done some research and written a report about Puerto Ricans in Central Florida. That came out right about the time I was moving there, and Luis Martinez Fernandez, who was at the University of Central Florida, was writing prolifically in local papers in both English and Spanish about the community. But that's kind of what I had to go on. And as an anthropologist, I did what we do, and I started hanging out and asking questions, but life was incredibly busy. I had this crazy job that had me driving all over to different campuses of Central Florida. So time was limited, but I identified pretty early on that I was hearing a local narrative about what this migration was about. It was about professional migration from Puerto Rico that emerged really in the 1990s. And much of that, there's a lot to be said for that narrative. I'm not trying to discount that narrative, but I kept finding other things that seemed to suggest that there were other narratives or another story or more to it. And the first was being from Puerto Rico, because the data from the census, well, both the census and what Felo and Jorge have in their report, really pointed much more to kind of a balanced population of people arriving from both Puerto Rico and from other diaspora spaces in the US North and West. And then there was at the time, unfortunately that has folded, but the Nuevo Dia newspaper had an Orlando edition for a while. And there were stories in there about people who just didn't fit the professional migration part of the narrative. And then I met a couple of people who were born in a couple of Puerto Ricans who were born in Central Florida in the 1940s. And so I started thinking, well, there's history obviously prior to the 1990s. So, and then finally I heard comments from some denigrating New York Puerto Ricans and yet still using the numbers from Felo and Jorge and from the census that really brought everybody together and talked about the size of the Puerto Rican population, which at that point and still is about 50% of the Latinx population in Central Florida. So the questions started to emerge. What is the history here and what is the disconnect about? And then over the next decade, the questions kept kind of changing. I wondered, well, who is speaking for whom? And what is the interplay of US and Puerto Rican politics? And what do race and class and place have to do with it all? So the result is a story about Latinx, but especially Puerto Rican political community formation amid diverse and often divergent experiences of race, class, and place of origin. And I thank you again for this honor, and I look forward to our conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Patricia. So the next question I wanted us to kind of get into was, what do you want people to know about what your research has uncovered? So what do you see as the biggest takeaways that you want people to really walk away from your books with? And Helena, let's start off with you.
So yes, I'm an anthropologist, but I realize also I'm very much a physician addiction psychiatrist. And so if you'll indulge that as an entry point, at the same time, so what I'm trying to do is speak back to really what's become a broadly medicalized discourse about addiction with research and findings about how people have creatively reinvented themselves and reinvented community as a way of addressing the problem of addiction, which as an anthropologist, I'm seeing very much as the product of power inequalities, interpersonal, but especially in terms of the race, class, gender, order, and still very colonial society. And so I started my work with these ideas about spiritual capital. I was kind of working through Pierre Bourdieu on, types of capital that are interchangeable with each other, because what I'd known from my work in HIV prevention and harm reduction was that is very much about power and capital, what people were trying to manage in their daily lives. And the idea that people can build alternatives to economic bases of power, such as, through symbolic capital and social capital networks, and connections and relationships, and also cultural capital, sources of knowledge, privileged knowledge. We often think about it in terms of formal education, but there are other kinds of knowledge that people can cultivate and that become a source of capital that can be translatable to economic resources and survival, or translatable to power in other circles. And so I came in with ideas about that. And what I think I came out the other end of my field research in these ministries that were founded and run by people who identify as former addicts that have actually been reborn into a completely other role as a spiritual leader. What I came away with was a set of ideas about what I call technologies of transformation, because in the face of a form of medicine in our country that's very focused on marketable biotechnologies and molecules, what I think we need so much more understanding of is social technologies. How can we promote health using relationships and ways of reconfiguring our communities and repositioning ourselves, kind of reimagining and re-identifying ourselves. And so that was what I found, what I thought I was really seeing in the end in the field. is that in these ministries, there was a very creative appropriation and recreation of evangelist tools of social technology. And it was not uncomplicated. I mean, there are so many things that I admired about what I was seeing. The fact that people who had very much been on the bottom of the social hierarchy in so many different ways without a foreseeable way out managed to, through these ministries, find a route to real authority and dignity and leadership for others out of narco traffic, a form of narco traffic that had been very violent and destructive of people's lives. So there were many things to be admired, and then it was not uncomplicated. And that's something that I tried to flesh out in my book, is that in many cases, these groups end up trading one set of hierarchies for another. So because the problems of the narco traffic industry in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in the Americas is very gendered, it's and complicated. Narco traffic and war on drugs policies have been a way that Puerto Rican men in particular have been multiply oppressed and imprisoned. And so one of the problems of these ministries was how to open up a route toward a different kind of masculine achievement and masculinity that was more affirming of life, and survival, both on a personal level and a community level. So that is a very promising thing, but in the end, it relied on a form of patriarchy that really excluded and left out women, of whom there are many who are directly affected by narco traffic. So, so it's not uncomplicated. And that's something that I try to flesh out in my book too, and remain true to, is the complexity of it. But I think in the end, what I really was able to take away from my study was the idea of social technologies, and in particular, technologies of transformation. How can people collectively and creatively reinvent themselves, reinvent their communities? And what they did was they tapped into a Pentecostal discourse of rejection of the material world and privileged access to this whole other realm of the spiritual, which gave people access to a form of power and a form of knowledge, direct knowledge and connection with the divine, that many people and institutions that had otherwise rejected them in the secular world didn't have access to. And so I found that to be a really interesting and creative repurposing of Christian symbolism and practices, but again, not uncomplicated, which is probably going to be the case for any social technology that we really want to understand and maybe adapt in part for the problems that we might see as health problems, but actually have a very strong basis in social inequality.
Thank you so much, Helena. Patricia, please.
Okay, I'm going to start with an anecdote. I was going to read it to you, but in the interest of time, I'll just try to summarize it a bit. It has to do with a Puerto Rican woman in Orlando. Her name is Zori. She's a political activist and has been very active in all of the places that she has lived. And we were completing an oral history at some point over that decade. I was there, I don't remember exactly when. And I think it was in 2012, actually, because the elections were just coming up. And she wanted to, she had this pile of t-shirts and we were about to end, and she was like, well, can I show you these t-shirts and talk about them? And I, of course, said yes. And they were a storyline of the political actions that she had been part of across her life. And they involved different places in the diaspora. They involved work between the diaspora and Puerto Rico. Together, what she did was, for me, it brought together her memories from Puerto Rico and places around the diaspora. And I like this anecdote because I think it's a way to help explain why I use the term translocal rather than transnational to describe Puerto Rican relations in Central Florida. In the book, I emphasize that place is, of course, an abstract and meaningful construction, but it's also importantly material. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. The third part of the book that focuses specifically on the geographic mapping of voting districts in Orange County is a case in point. We can perhaps talk about that later on in the discussion. I also emphasize in the book that Orlando is a place that is historically divided into Black and white. So the book holds other anecdotes about Puerto Ricans and Latinxes working to find a place between Black and white. Much of my data, particularly in the second part, as I'm trying to trace the history, draws on oral histories, on individual stories from place-specific Puerto Rican experiences from island and diaspora. And this is exactly what Zori was pinpointing. And I try to think about the impacts of that on organizing in Central Florida in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. So to some extent, I see this book as an ethnographic example of Doreen Massey's argument that it's about the importance of seeing, and this is in quotes, that what has come together in this place now is a conjunction of many histories and many spaces. Zori's political actions also help to draw the distinction that I make between identity and identification. Zori is very proud of her Puerto Rican identity, but it's also via that identity, that thing, that she connects and identifies with others who recognize and share the struggle. So for a look at race, class, and Latinx politics in Puerto Rican Orlando, this distinction between the thing of identity and the process of identification, to me, holds the key to understanding the contingency, ongoing contingency of political community formation. Now, for instance, during the redistricting process, Zori objected loudly as a Puerto Rican when Puerto Ricans were left out of the Hispanic representation on the advisory committee. And she went so far as to ask other Hispanics to step down so a Puerto Rican could be on the committee. Not that that actually happened, but she was very outspoken about it. But as the process continued, she shifted her identification to Hispanic. And I'm saying Hispanic in quotes, that is very often the phrase, or at least certainly at the time of my research was what people were saying in Orlando. So she shifted her identification to Hispanic as she worked with others against plans to divide up the Latinx population into 3 districts. So for me, this anecdote points to, I think there are other takeaways, but the 2 that I thought I'd focus on here for us to think about in both our scholarship and activism. One is this distinction between identity and identification, both being very valid concepts, but I think that the distinction is useful for getting at some subtleties about identity politics and political organizing. And then the second, that time and place matter. I'm reminded of early on in the book, I think I have this quotation from Clifford Geertz when he talks about how important it is to just where we are. How does he put it? He says, how much it matters just where we are and what it means to be there. So that's, I guess, my 2 takeaways for now. We can talk more about it later.
Great, thank you, Patricia. Ismael.
Thank you. One of the most important issues that I want people to learn from my book is how the dominant deportation regime in the United States construct not only immigrants, but also citizens, and in the case of Puerto Ricans, colonial migrants. As soon as Puerto Ricans became US citizens in 1917, farmers in the United States feared the replacement of deportable immigrants, mostly Mexican, with Puerto Ricans. This issue has been ongoing until the present time. One quote made in 1927 by an official from a Growers Association in California is the best example of the attitudes that some farmers still have against Puerto Ricans. And I quote, the Puerto Rican Negro is a thin-lipped Negro and is not efficient as the Mexican. We cannot handle them like Mexicans. A Puerto Rican has much right to stay as we have. He cannot be deported as can a Mexican. The Mexican can be deported if they become county charges, but the others are here to stay, unquote. So there's this fear that Puerto Ricans would be the option that the United States Employment Service would use at the beginning of the 20th century. And the growers began this campaign that lasted until the 1940s. And we still have recent cases of Puerto Ricans in New York State, New Jersey, and Michigan that have been fired in favor of undocumented and guest workers. And it's because U.S. agriculture relies on deportable migrants. It's not that the undocumented workers are taking away the jobs of Puerto Rican workers. This is the fault of politicians, the growers, and also the managers of agribusinesses that prefer this deportation regime to be in place in the United States. And in this way, my book is a history of the present, right? I'm going back to the early 20th century to talk about what is still happening in US farm labor with Puerto Ricans. Another issue in my book is how power structures the feelings of farm workers. And at the same time, how these feelings shape the migratory field. And this is exemplified by some of what Puerto Rican government officials thought and experienced with farm workers. And I have a couple of quotes. For example, one government official says, quote, "Many of our workers tell us that they couldn't stand the cold. We're not referring to the cold caused by a change of season, but the internal cold produced when they are ignored, never receiving a word of encouragement," quote. So there's all this information flowing between Puerto Rico and the United States about the labor conditions in the camps, in the fields. There's another another quote of a worker that wrote to the government of Puerto Rico, and he indicates that, quote, many crimes in the fields occur because the farmers think that we are obligated to be prisoners, unquote. So there's this recurring complaint of workers talking about this feeling like living in prisons when they are working in the fields and sleeping in the labor camps. In the labor camps, workers' experience are shaped by these feelings of estrangement, right? They feel that everything is alien to them, but also their migration is not only shaped by these feelings of estrangement. Also, they have this hope, right? A hope of improving their standard of living, securing a better future for themselves and their family. So this perception of impersonal relationships and also this hope of improving their lives is what they actually promote their migration to the United States. And these quotes and many others in my book capture these experiences, right, that are relevant to the history of Puerto Ricans in U.S. farm labor. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So I, in full disclosure, sent the questions ahead of time to the panelists, but I'm gonna throw a curveball if no one, which is actually prompted by something that Ismael said, which was, you had joked that you had to cut 100 pages from your book, right? And, one of my favorite questions, I think something that's actually helpful for kind of early career scholars, junior scholars to hear about is, the book you see in front of you is probably like 10% of the research you actually did, right? So people talk about it almost like an iceberg, right? The majority of the iceberg is underwater, and you just see the tippy top or whatever. So I'm actually curious if you all could talk about were there things you had to kind of like leave on the cutting room floor, or that maybe you didn't have time or an opportunity to research, right? Maybe they came towards the end of your field work, or you felt like you didn't have the bandwidth or whatever to kind of research it further. I'm curious, are there things that either you wish had made it into the book or that you had to leave behind in the book? And so anyone who wants to answer it can kind of jump in, but I'm curious. I think it's helpful for folks to kind of hear some of the kind of editing choices I think that authors have to make. So sorry for the curveball, but I couldn't resist.
I can hop in a bit. I'm not sure if this really addresses it, but I'm trying to think as you're asking the question, and I'm sure that did happen, but I'm not sure I remember anymore what it was, because there was the whole process of going through the book, and came out a year ago and so forth, that some of that fades. What did happen in some was that, I had, after 10 years, a lot of stuff, and a lot of it was useful and a lot of it not always so certain. But sometimes as I was writing, I would be like, oh yeah, there was that thing. And I'd think of that and go find it. What is kind of interesting, and those of you who have read it or will read it will have your own opinions about it, but I was actually recommended to me at one point to leave the whole third section of the book out. And I did, in fact, end up publishing an article, which is kind of that section. And but I felt it was really important to keep it in. And I guess I won that argument or whatever. But the idea of the redistricting itself was such a separate topic that there were times I was kind of struggling to try to make it really clear why I felt it was so important for it to be in. But it did stay in at the end. So.
In my book, I have more than 10,000 images of documents, secondary sources, plus the interviews, a survey. And what I feel is that some sections within chapters can become books because there's so much information there, so much information that I didn't manage to find, and I know that after many years looking in the archives, I got to the point where I could find the same letter in an archive in Puerto Rico, in Washington D.C. or in New York State. So my advice to graduate students is to write and write and write, and you then worry about editing, about leaving things on the side, because you will never finish if you want to find every detail for your book or for your dissertation.
That is such wise advice. And while I don't know if I can comment on what I had to leave out, maybe I can comment in terms of process on how long it took. So while I am not a model citizen for everyone else to follow, because I didn't have the advice that that Professor Garcia-Colón had or is giving now, it really took me 10 years to turn my fieldwork into a book for a wide variety of reasons. The fact that I was also pursuing clinical training and had 2 children, and lots of things happened. But fortunately, I didn't give up on this dream of turning what was then my dissertation into a book. And looking back on it, I would not have been able to write it in the form that it is now, fresh out of graduate school. So I was able to, because of all the time that passed, I was able to weave in narratives from my clinical training, narratives about other concepts of addiction that I could contrast with the one that I studied in Puerto Rico. And so in the end, I feel as though my manuscript probably, at least I felt more satisfied. I felt it was more complete. The analysis was more complete because I'd had the benefit of that time and seeing the same questions from multiple different angles. So I would say, if you happen to be one of those that didn't take Professor Garcia-Colón's advice and took longer to finish, that there can also be a benefit to letting things mature and to gaining perspective on the field work with time. So maybe that's a way that I console myself, but I feel good that I was able to put pieces from different points in my research career together. And what I find is the story doesn't end, you know, so now I've gone in a completely other direction and I'm studying pharmaceutical companies and I'm studying, you know, the origins of this brain disease model. But I find that my fieldwork in addiction ministries and in Puerto Rico, it's such a different place, profoundly hones and shapes what I see, you know, in laboratories or in pharmaceutical company strategy. So there are ways that these projects, they're lifelong projects. I find, you know, that's kind of the same concerns are bringing me back to similar questions in many different places. And so the work benefits from that. So it's, and maybe that's a little bit of the same spirit of, don't wait for a finished nugget, that these things, that your research kind of, it's a continuum and it threads through multiple projects and different elements of your work can feed each other and inform each other.
Let me add that I began the first research that I did about farm workers was in 2005. And you know, I got to the point, right, that I felt that I had enough information, but it took me many years to go through the information, analyze it, and rushing to write is not also a good methodology because, and we can talk about this later, but you know, I had the opportunity then to find new ways to interpret the data that I was finding because I took time to write it.
Great, thank you. See, I'm so glad I asked that question. We got so many wonderful answers. So I wanted to ask you all to just comment a little bit. You know, obviously Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, as well as in the diaspora, find themselves confronting a profound moment of crisis caused by ongoing colonization and capitalist dislocations, which I think you all you know, address to in different respects in each of your projects. So I wanted to ask, how does your research help us to think about the root causes of these crises? You know, and Ismael, you talked about it as kind of a history of the present, but how can we think about the root causes of these crises and perhaps see ways of addressing them that comes out of your research? And Ismael, if you want to get us started.
Yes. So, I mean, my book, one of the topics that I'm exploring is the way that the government of Puerto Rico dealt with unemployment in the islands, right? And the farm labor program initiated a migratory flow whose scope and unprecedented consequences surpass the capacity of the government of Puerto Rico to manage that migration. In promoting migration as an escape valve for unemployment, then the government of Puerto Rico established this infrastructure to migrate that is the infrastructure that the current migrants in the 21st century are using, right? Many of the communities around the Northeast, Puerto Rican communities, emerged from farm workers that arrived in those places, like in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Springfield, Massachusetts, and so on. We can list many of these stateside communities that emerged as a result of the farm labor program. But I mean, the government of Puerto Rico decided to take this initiative, right, to promote migration as a policy, instead of taking maybe other policies like diversified agriculture, creating a real agrarian reform. But you know, it didn't choose to do that, and I think this is one of the reasons why now it's easier for Puerto Ricans to escape the crisis, escape from this long crisis of around 20 years in Puerto Rico. At the same time, seasonal farm labor migration continues. The reception of Puerto Ricans in the United States is the same as are the similar experiences, right? When with the IDs, the discrimination against them, the xenophobia in this country affects Puerto Ricans and these recent migrants. I will say also that U.S. immigration policies are part of how the state, how the government organizes inequality, right? And this is how it has shaped the lives of undocumented migrants in the United States, but also the lives of Puerto Ricans in the United States. And there are many issues that I could continue talking about on how this, you know, the current situation is related. It has roots, right, in mid 20th century Puerto Rico, and others go even to the early 1900s.
Great, thank you, Ismael. Patricia.
I keep forgetting to unmute, I apologize. Yeah, I'd love to say that my book solves all the problems, but I don't think it does that. I do hope that it is useful in the way that it brings up questions and the dilemmas about heterogeneity and political community formation, that might be useful for us to bring to bear as we continue to think about organizing between Puerto Rico and the diaspora. Some of my research was really ending as some of the most recent series of most consequential events were happening. And so I was kind of more in New York than Orlando, and but I was still trying to take things in. And in Orlando, I saw efforts, for instance, as the economic crisis was not really beginning, but beginning to be acknowledged. And there was actually what turned out to be the first meeting of what became the Puerto Rican agenda actually happened in Orlando. And I saw, you know, people came from all over the diaspora, they came from all over Puerto Rico, and it was really intended to be an effort to look at ways that the diaspora can be working for the betterment of conditions in Puerto Rico. And then next thing we know, we have Hurricane Maria. And again, I was not in Orlando at the time, I was in New York, but when I got back to Orlando, I added my efforts to the massive efforts going on to bring relief to Puerto Rico. And those were efforts that involved people across the board, across all the Puerto Rican heterogeneity, Latinx, Black, white. There were a lot of people that just wanted to do what they could. So these were major efforts at organizing difficult ways. But of course, bickering happened, and the divisions I've been seeing over the years, race and class and so forth, and politics, certainly in the Puerto Rican, in the meeting that was in Orlando that became the Puerto Rican agenda was very much kind of disrupted by US and Puerto Rican politics. And so those things were all happening, despite the efforts to organize and really bring something good to Puerto Rico. And we're all familiar with the expression balde de bueyes, and I started thinking about the balde de bueyes and the comment about how, one crab is trying to crawl out of the bucket and another crab is pulling them back down in, and a lot of self-criticism for that kind of activity going on. And yes, my book spends a lot of time looking at some of that activity. And I think it's important to recognize, but I also really started thinking about, well, let's take a look at what's turning up the heat metaphorically outside of the balde, right? What is making it so hard to be inside that pot and be everybody trying to get out and pull at each other? And these are the conditions in which Ismael articulates, I think, much more eloquently than I do, but these are the conditions that are fomented by colonization and by ongoing capitalist dislocations. And so I think that, I hope that kind of image of the balde, not only of the balde, but what's turning up the heat outside, I hope that's useful. And to return to place, in the book, I drew from Juan Gonzalez's Harvest of Empire to really think about this parallel history of neoliberalism around Latin America, and then the so-called Latinization of the US, and especially the US South. And I kept thinking of I coined a phrase that I call natural neoliberalism, which might sound kind of odd, but I'll try to explain that. I think I coined it. I don't know if I've heard it anywhere else, but I really began to realize, being in Florida, which is the South, and sometimes we forget that, the irony of the neoliberal policies that were pushing these dislocations, but the pulls that were offering opportunities for people to move to the US South. And that's both from Latin America and also from other spaces in the US North. And that pull was totally related to the fact that there's a very long history in the US South of anti-union, of right-to-work legislation. I think that Florida, if I'm right, I think Florida was the first state in the United States to pass right-to-work legislation in the 1940s. So that's why I tend to think about this as what I call natural neoliberalism, that rather than a set of policies being kind of dictated and imposed from above, if you will, and a conscious effort to kind of manipulate personhood to shift from collective thinking to this individualist, neoliberal personhood. Rather than that, this is actually in Southern histories, at least in Orlando, and I won't speak for other places, but again, I would urge us to think about that when we're trying to figure out how to organize, that these spaces in the South, it's almost just deeply embedded in their history already, entrepreneurialism, individualism, and kind of an anti-collective sort of thinking. So I hope that those, I kind of in my own head just think about balde de bueyes and natural neoliberalism, and try to think about how is that useful for us to bring to bear on our efforts as scholars and as activists trying to organize.
Thank you. Helena.
Thank you for that question. And I guess there are two different threads in my book. One really does try to do due diligence of setting up the political economic context for both narco traffic and Pentecostalism in Puerto Rico, because it turns out that Puerto Rico's unique status as a US colony located between Latin America and North America has a lot to do with the strength of both phenomena on the island. On the one hand, it is still a major port, probably the major port after the Mexican border for Latin American produced narcotics, illegalized narcotics to enter North America. And that is due to its status. There isn't the same kind of customs check at the for products entering the US through Puerto Rico as there is at other borders. And so that's one reason that in the time of my field work, heroin and cocaine in particular were entering through Puerto Rico, and there was such a local industry around the transfer of heroin and cocaine through Puerto Rico into North America. North America being probably the world's largest consumer of those products. I know I can say specifically around opioids that we consume 80% of the world's opioids, including heroin, and we represent, when I say we, mainland US, less than 5% of the world's population. So this is a huge industry, and so movement of that traffic through the island constitutes a huge industry on the island. But on the other hand, Protestant evangelism has had a long history and footprint on the island because, again, of the unique colonial status of Puerto Rico and its geographic location. So Puerto Rico has been for over a century a way to for North American Protestant evangelists to, it's been a gateway to the Caribbean and the rest of Latin America. And there's been a Spanish speaking ministry starting off in Puerto Rico that's played a really big role. And so these two threads I saw as connecting on the island in fascinating ways. But then the other part of my structural analysis focuses on what can those of us who are not necessarily evangelists, but are concerned about ways of pushing back against the violence of the narco traffic that has in many ways been imposed on the island because of so many political and economic constraints and decisions that have come from people that are suffering have not come from the people who are suffering the impact. So I came to see Puerto Rican addiction ministries as a form of resistance to redefine what had been both a crime and a health problem, seen as both a crime and a health problem of addiction in Puerto Rico, as a problem that's related to violence and moral emptiness of an overly materialistic capitalist order. And so there is this very interesting discourse in the ministries of the disposable generation, and a critique of that emptiness. And so what I am attempting to do in learning from how they structure that and how the ministries have been able to tap into many techniques to form an alternative kind of place of belonging. Patricia mentioned anti-collective impulse. So there's certainly a form of collectivity that they were creating in the ministries. What I want to do is put a lens on how grassroots organizations can, in the face of such kind of dire inequalities of power and economic forces, create a sense of connection and meaning and lead towards collective action, and generate their own form of critical consciousness. So that's really kind of the lens that I was looking at it through, and perhaps inspired too from other resistance movements that have often centered around health. I mean, health is one place where you see inequalities manifest in the most concrete ways. And so, for example, I'm thinking of the Young Lords Party in the early 70s, active in the South Bronx, took over Lincoln Hospital, literally took it over and repurposed the facilities there and the medical care vans and ambulances to deliver screening and treatment in community in the South Bronx. And so I come back to the necessity in addressing what we are thinking of as health problems now that really are a manifestation of profound power inequalities, that there are approaches, grassroots approaches to creating connection, meaning, critical consciousness, another way of looking at the world that doesn't lead people to have no way out, that gives them, a channel for action. So that was my focus, so that in the face of these incredibly overdetermined political economic circumstances, how is it that people creatively work together and reinvent, attribute new meaning to what they've experienced, that it's not necessarily due to their own deficits, which is that individualizing anti-collective narrative that Patricia was referencing, because that is paralyzing to many of us. People of color in this country are very much paralyzed by the individualism of, self-blame and self-attribution, and it's very strong in addiction, the way that people talk about addiction. So what are some ways that people creatively retool that and create a path out and a path for collective action? So that's where some of my structural analysis comes in, kind of looking at the grassroots and the potential for change there.
Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. So we'll shift to audience questions. We have quite a few questions, and I'm trying to be mindful of time, make sure we all have our Fridays, although I feel like we could stay here all day because it's such a great conversation. So the first question is actually for Patricia from Margaret Power. Margaret says, congratulations, what wonderful and unique books you all have written. Patricia, could you explain more about what you see as the difference between identity and identification and what that difference makes?
Okay. I think, well, I kind of sum it up in the difference between a thing and a process. And there's nothing, I don't mean that in any way to be negative about identity by any means, but I do find that because it's, well, there's a real contradiction for me in that, particularly in Puerto Rican history, but more widely speaking, I think in much of the identity politics that we are seeing and efforts at intersectionality and so forth, I think when we think about identity as a thing, that can be very useful because it is something we use to connect with other people. It also gets used against us sometimes, and it has a tendency to, I think, to rigidify and then create kind of an in and an out. The in-group and the out-group of any given group of people. So among Puerto Ricans, it depends on how is that identity going to be expressed. Are you talking, if we're looking at divisions of race and class and so forth, if we're talking about, say, this group of people in Orlando are a professional migration that came here from Puerto Rico, and we don't really think that New York Puerto Ricans count. They're not really Puerto Rican, right? So that's a way in which I think that it can be used to exclude people. Obviously, it's also very much used to include people, and part of what I think is perhaps unique in the dislocations of all of Puerto Rico's history, and as we've been talking about the colonization and the capitalist dislocations there, that I think in some way the thingness, if I can use that expression, of whatever it is, whatever Puerto Ricanidad is helpful to tie people together across all of those spaces. So by no means am I saying I think that identity is not a good thing, but I think when we stress identification, it helps open up that category of identity. It helps connect to other people. And that's why I use that example, really kind of a pedantic example, I think, of the switching, right? In Orlando, Zori is a good example. Like sometimes she's Puerto Rican, sometimes she's Hispanic, sometimes she's American. So that's choosing those different identity labels can be a very strategic process. And but that can also be used. Well, actually, an example of this was the way that kind of fixed identity idea got used against the community. In the lawsuit, I'll try to do this as succinctly as I can. In the lawsuit, I was actually one of the witnesses or expert witnesses, supposedly, on the side of Latino justice, trying to argue that Latino vote had been diluted. And through my deposition, although in the early process, right, they had this advisory committee. The advisory committee had 3 Hispanics on it. That was all supposed to be very inclusive, that there were no Puerto Ricans, didn't seem to matter to anybody except the Puerto Ricans. And then when it came to, and then as the process went on, it really became a collective effort, speaking as Hispanics, Latinxes, and so forth, to try to have a district. When the lawsuit came about, in my deposition, the very people that had argued about it's all fine, we've got Hispanic representation, worked very hard. They asked me over and over and over again about whether Puerto Ricans and Cubans get along. And their point was to really show that these are two different groups of people and they don't like each other and they don't get along. And it was very pointed kind of way. So I think of the thingness of identity as something that can be used both to help collective organization, but it also can be used, it can be part of those elements outside the balde, right, that help turn up the heat. And so I think it's just important for us to recognize that. It's not to throw out either thing, but to see that as a difference between a thing and a process. I hope that helps. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. So we have a question from Ann McPherson. Ann says, I think this goes along with the cutting room floor question. Either Helena or Patricia said they were aiming for an audience of mainly undergrads, but also still engaging for graduate students. I'm wondering how you went about structuring writing the book for these two audiences. So I think that question can be open to whoever wants to respond, but how are you all thinking about juggling the various audiences that you're trying to reach with your work?
Maybe I'll jump in here and say that one of the things that I love so much about anthropology as a discipline is that it foregrounds narrative. And that makes it both easier and harder to write for a variety of audiences, because easier in that if you get it right, you have the freedom, unlike in some disciplines, you have the freedom to tell stories in a way that can engage on many different levels. And I think any reader, it's kind of our nature as people to engage with a compelling narrative. So even if someone is not an expert in Puerto Rico, or not an expert in addictions, or not an expert in electoral politics or in migrant farm work, if there's a compelling narrative there, what it will do is draw them in and help them to see how the case study along any of those lines can inform their thinking about the world. That's the beauty of it. So there's not such a formal structure to the kind of book that we write in our discipline, that it's hard to begin with the compelling story or vignette and then track that through. On the other hand, it's very hard to write a compelling story. So that's the difficult part of it, is that there's definitely an art to narrative. And for me, I actually found it very useful to connect with myself and what I found so compelling in the field. And in anthropology, we also have more of a precedent, which I think in the multidisciplinary field of Puerto Rican studies is also a precedent, that the personal is both political and also knowledge. It's a fount of knowledge. There's no such thing as a knowledge from nowhere, or a view from nowhere. That's a part of what we end up critiquing a lot, in fact. And so what that does is it gives legitimacy to the exercise of our understanding. Well, what brought me to this story? Like, why would I find this so, what is it about my own experience that would lead me to this place and this time and seeing it in the way that I do? There's, of course, the danger of navel gazing. It's, we shame on us if we spend all this time in the field trying to engage people and then write about ourselves. So, it's the self-other, it's us in interaction with the people that we're working with in the field. And if you can get that right and bring it into narrative form, then I think it's compelling for a wide range of people. So it doesn't matter so much their predisposition to be interested in our subject matter.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. Ismael, Patricia, I don't know if you want to say anything. So that's fine.
I can add a quick thing. I think I've almost forgotten exactly what the question was, but I get the idea of how to write in that way. And I think one simple thing I think that I was trying to do was basically not use really, really, really long words. I know that sounds funny, but I think some of the concepts don't have to be that hard, but sometimes we make them hard. And I I didn't always succeed at that. And then I also, this is just very practical level, I also put together a reader's guide on the website for the book with the point of helping direct different readers to read differently. And I think in that I even maybe suggest, as if you're the undergraduate professor, you might want to make a lecture of the first couple chapters and don't ask your students necessarily to read it all. So that's part of how I went at it. And then again, very much as Helena was saying, yeah, finding the stories that help move it along. And the stories were there, but then linking them together and making them compelling enough to keep going can be a challenge.
When I write thinking that the people that I am writing about are going to read it, or their children or grandchildren. So when I was writing this book, I was thinking that this is the story of many Puerto Ricans in the United States, and that eventually one person that their parent or grandparent migrated as a farm worker will find the book interesting. So in a way, I wasn't writing for scholars. I mean, the theory is there, but my goal was not to write to the scholars. It was to write to the, my audience, my principal audience was the farm workers and their descendants.
Thank you, everyone.
Can I add one more thing?
Oh, yeah.
In the
Please.
mix, which is that I'm gaining as I go along an appreciation for multimedia. And I think our younger scholars are leading the way in that, in using film and using podcasts. I have younger colleagues that are very creative in taking the material and the analysis from the field and putting it into other forms. So books are certainly still the core of the disciplines, but I think that taking some of these analyses and the stories that go along with them and putting them into accessible forms such as short films or podcast episodes helps to really broaden the audience. And I'm seeing my colleagues use those kinds of materials in their teaching as well. So, books that's one format, but I think as we expand and multiply the numbers of forms of media that we can work with, that we'll be able to reach even more kinds of audiences. And that's a valuable thing, a valuable development. It'll require us to collaborate with others. So I've worked on some film projects, but I would never have been able to do it on my own. There's just too much technically required for it, but we can find collaborators and work in many different mediums.
That's a good point. I have worked in a digital exhibit, and now I was contacted by a photographer that he took photos of farm workers in the 1970s, and we are trying to work in this photographic exhibit in Philadelphia. So
that's exciting.
We'll see.
Great. So Helena, I have a quick question for you, which is from Joanna Camacho. Are these religious organizations that you discuss in your book particular to a region of Puerto Rico, or is it pretty widespread throughout the archipelago?
That is a great question. I focused my study in southern Puerto Rico, but these ministries they're pretty widespread across the island, both in urban and rural areas. What's interesting to look at is that they have relationships with ministries on the mainland and internationally now. So these are international movements, but there has been incredible cross-fertilization and connection between ministries on the mainland and on the island. The mainland ministries tend to be in big cities that have been, historic ports for narco traffic, and also places where there are significant Puerto Rican, Black, Latinx populations that have been involved in the narco traffic, and then and the economic displacement that led to their involvement, and are looking for alternatives. So it's a fascinating story of different influences from different places coming together. And in fact, if you look at the history of Pentecostalism, their early Black and Mexican ministers that really shaped Pentecostalism into the multi-layered and multi-sectorial thing that it is today. So, you know, in the beginning, there were multiracial groups that were taking on, like Azusa Street Ministries in 1908 in Los Angeles, that were taking up Pentecostal practice as a way to unite the peoples of the world. And so the speaking in tongues from the Tower of Babel, you know, it indicated to them that they were bringing together the peoples of the world. And then very quickly, US racial politics came in, and there was a Spanish speaking contingent that split off, you know, and took root in Puerto Rico. And then there was a Black contingent that split off. But beyond that, I would say the interesting thing about these ministries is how multidimensional they are and how they've taken particular shape in Puerto Rico and in Center City, US, where narco traffic has been a real crisis, you know, real focus of concern.
Thank you. So we have two, I want us to start wrapping up. So we have two questions, and I think they actually speak to each other quite, there's some interesting possibilities for overlap. So I'm going to ask them together and kind of answer in the way that they makes the most sense to you all. So the first question is from Rebecca Rivera Roballo. Did you experience any resistance from individuals or groups while conducting your research? If so, how did you overcome or bypass that? And the second question from Fiona Bernal also asked kind of about methodology. So can the panelists perhaps say something about ethnography and interdisciplinary methodologies / approaches for interrogating Puerto Rican community formation, succession, and what these methodologies open up, especially for current grad students? So, you know, I was joking, we didn't have any anthropologists on the committee, but have ended up with a panel full of anthropologists. But I think that speaks to, I think, the power of ethnography and kind of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary approaches to ethnography for capturing something at this particular moment that, you know, is quite interesting. So I'll open it up to, so question of if you experience resistance, and then a question about kind of methods.
I can go. I could have written a book without conducting any oral histories, just based on documents. But when actually I did first oral histories, then going fully into the archives. I did some preliminary research in the archives, and then immediately I went in the summer of 2007. I went to the field to try to collect oral histories in Southern New Jersey. I thought that, you know, I'm gonna talk to these elderly Puerto Ricans, and got there, and I visited camps full of Puerto Rican farm workers. And I think that that's the difference of using ethnography and oral histories to do this kind of historical work. Sometimes I had to face farmers that didn't want me to interview the workers. And in a way, it is, you know, sometimes you really have to go to the archives, but I mean, you cannot do that. This is not there's not a perfect way to do it, right? Like I visited this farmer, and he was very resistant, and I learned later, looking at the archives, that he had, the government of Puerto Rico had troubles with him, and he mistreated the workers. But other farmers were really open, right? When you don't have anything to hide, some of them will tell me, yeah, go ahead and interview them in the middle of the field when they were working. And of course I will say, no, I will come back in the afternoon. And because I am a male, so it was easier, I guess, for me, that I had that privilege to be able to approach the workers, but not just because of that. It's also because where I come from in Puerto Rico, working class background, the type of Spanish that I speak. So it's for me easier to talk in the same Spanish that they use. So, you know, there are going to be differences. Of course, I'm the professor, but, you know, I think I felt that it was easier for me to approach the workers.
It's your last comment made me realize that, yes, I struggled with limitation, because at first I was going to say that for me, the issue was that I was very much welcomed into the ministries that I was studying, to the point where I realized, oh yes, they're evangelizing me, and that's what they think they're going to get out of my fieldwork. And then their second choice was, well, you're going to be spreading our message, our word of Christ, to the rest of the world through your writings. So that was a strange and awkward opposite, in a way, situation, where I was being incredibly welcomed into the inner circle and then invited to join them, literally. But gender was definitely and all sorts of things too. The fact that I'm not Puerto Rican, that I was speaking a broken Spanish and always trying to understand what was being said. But certainly, because the ministries were so segregated by gender, and there's so many gender politics happening within the ministries, there were many places that I did not have access to. So, and I knew better to even ask. You know, they were just places where I, as a identified woman, could not be. And what that did, though, was it forced me, first of all, it was the source of some discoveries about the ministries and their use of gender in many ways to establish another power dynamic. But it also forced me into places where I might not have been as much otherwise. So I ended up going to the very few women's ministries that existed and spending more time there than I'd originally planned to. And that was really enlightening. And then I was able to track some of the women who dropped out of that ministry to understand the impact of the gendered ways that the practices that were being used had on them. So it also, I think that happens in any ethnography, is that you learn from the exclusions, and you learn from the errors and the mistakes. That's how you learn the cultural logics and the groups and institutions that you're studying. You learn by bumping up against their boundaries, no?
Yeah, that is very, very true. I'm thinking about the first resistance that for me in Orlando was actually coming from myself, because I went there because of a job at the university, and I was coming from Puerto Rico, and but I'm not Puerto Rican. And people kept saying, oh, you're an anthropologist, you have to really dig in and learn about what's going on in Orlando. And I just kept thinking, well, who am I to just decide I've arrived in Orlando and I'm going to tell this story? And my assumption was that was probably the attitude of most of the people that I was meeting, like, ¿Quién se cree ella? Right? And but I found with time that was actually not true. Some people really, really welcomed it. And maybe perhaps because of the divisions, the fact that I was not Puerto Rican was something that they welcomed. Some people welcomed because they felt I didn't have an agenda. I wasn't trying to show a particular story. And so I think in that sense, but I think to the question of ethnography in general, an important thing to say about it is that it's very contingent on building trust with the people that you're working with, and deserving that trust and maintaining that trust over a very long period of time and ongoing. And that's hard work. It requires showing up and being there, and sometimes leaving an event at 2 in the morning and going home and writing up field notes for 2 hours. I can't say it always happened that way. Sometimes a week later, you're still writing up the field notes, but it can be very exhausting. But I think it's the only way really to get that, to be able to hear the real stories. And, you know, we say that in ethnography, we're trying to see the world through other people's eyes. And of course you can't do that. You know, it's something that cannot be done. But I think you can get closest by being able to build those relationships. So I think ethnography is all about relationships. And I also, Ismael's point about oral histories, which I used a lot also. In my case, I did not have a lot. I mean, I dug into lots of archives, but at the end of the day, there wasn't that much because there's just this invisibility of Latinos and Puerto Ricans in the archive in Central Florida. But to me, the oral histories became, one, the way to build the history as best as I could, and knowing that, of course, people don't always remember things quite the way they happen, but also as the way to connect the individual to the larger questions. And I think, again, that's something that ethnography can do along with oral history. I think those are two very, very powerful tools in that.
Thank you all. So I think this is a perfect place to wrap up and end the conversation. But I want to, again, offer congratulations and thank you to all of the panelists, and thank you so much for your amazing, amazing work. I want to remind all the attendees to please come tomorrow, join us. We're going to have the town hall at 4 p.m. Eastern. Followed by our plenary panel on critical Rican race studies, which is sure to be just a showstopper. So please try to make that. That'll be at 6 p.m. Again, you can always register through our website, ricanstudies.com, and you'll receive the Zoom links prior to those events. So thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.